What is going on, investors? Hopefully you guys are having a great Friday. Interesting show we've got planned here for today. We're going to talk about all the FANG stocks in particular, Microsoft and Tesla as well. We'll run down the news, lots of news, obviously, surrounding particularly President Trump with Facebook and Apple and Amazon and Google. Boy, lots of news there. Lots of news out of Tesla as well. And then we'll jump over to the stock chart as well. I think you're going to want to hang around for this segment. Couple of these stocks are at absolutely critical levels if you want to come in here and buy based on the technicals that have held true over the last few months. Boy, there's some great levels here. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. Now, starting things off with the news, let's jump right into Facebook. Boy, they had an eventful week. Started the week at about 257, peaked up a little bit, slid down a little bit. I think a large part to do, they got themselves into the news after President Trump and all the stuff that went down in Washington. President Trump basically been wiped out of all the platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube. Pretty much all of them have sent Mr. Trump, President Trump, packing. And whether or not this is a great idea, I'll tell you what, I'm not exactly sure if this is a good strategy by these companies. I'll tell you what, here's how I see this. Okay, first of all, Facebook probably less tied to political speech than, say, a Twitter was. I'd probably, if we were analyzing Twitter over this, probably have a little bit different opinion. Facebook just has so many users and there's so much stuff that goes on Facebook that I think they'll come out of this whether or not they allow Trump back on or they don't. I don't think it really matters. I think that their platforms will do well. I think advertisers will be there. I think the conversions will be there. So the advertisers will be there. This is likely just kind of a shorter term. Now, when you're talking about Twitter and maybe a site like that, maybe a little bit different story. But here's the key thing. Probably if you're watching this, you're either a supporter of Trump or you really don't like him. Okay, there's really rarely any in between when it becomes to our previous president, President Trump. So what I would do though, if you're an investor, try to stay level-headed with these types of things, okay? Because here's the deal. Yeah, the current administration and the party in power right now probably actually likes Facebook and Twitter to be doing this. They're probably in the background cheering these guys on. Well, wait a second. What happens in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years when maybe that's not the case? So that's the thing that you just want to keep in mind, that right now might end up working out. Over the next couple of years, might work out. The stocks might perform well. So I wouldn't necessarily, I don't think for Facebook this is that big of a deal. We'll see what happens going forward, but I don't think many people are going to cancel their accounts based on this. Moving on to Apple, start of the week at 129, basically flat, down a couple bucks. Most of these stocks sold off this week. Apple sell 12 million iPhone units, 18 million iPhone 12 units in China in Q4. So that's according to DigiTimes. That's pretty good. That's a 20% market share. I've been just seeing absolute blowout numbers from the iPhone 12. I think it's going to do as well or better than expectations. Should find out about that here in a couple weeks when Apple reports earnings. I think all things looking good for the iPhone 12. Now, Tesla pulled an Apple move in self-driving, leaving Apple Car way behind. So this is ARK Invest. Obviously, ARK Invest is kind of a cheerleader for Tesla because they've got tons and tons of Tesla shares and it kind of leads their ETFs. So I wouldn't take that, take what they say about Tesla with a grain of salt, but they do make a good point here. Okay, Tesla is way out in front in terms of self-driving. I doubt some of these other companies are going to really catch up very quickly. Okay, and especially when Apple's not projected to come out with a car for 4 or 5 years. Okay, can they do testing? Can they improve their technology? Yes. Will Tesla be doing the same thing over that time frame? Probably so. I think the Apple Car, while it's really good for headlines, really good for the news, probably actually good for the stock. I don't necessarily think it's going to bring a bunch of earnings and profits into Apple like the iPhone has. Now, more news out of Apple and including Google and Amazon as well. Okay, the top app stores, Apple and Google, kicked off the social media app Parler, which was popular for quote unquote free speech and things like that. And it was more popular, it seemed like, with Republicans or conservatives than it was with maybe Democrats or liberals or independents. So it's really, I tell you what, I think you can form opinions here, but again, on an investing show and an investing site, you got to stay level-headed. Is Parler not being on an Apple iPhone going to affect people from buying the iPhone? Probably not. Is this going to impact Apple at some point in the future, if it continues to get in this business of kind of censoring different kind of apps and things like that, yeah, it's going to get it into some trouble. When that happens, I don't know. Could the stock be up 40, 50, 60% by the time that news comes? Yeah, probably so. So I wouldn't really worry about this too much, but I don't necessarily, it makes me a little uneasy that Apple and Google and Amazon are kind of getting into the business of this and really have this type of influence. But look, it's where we're at with these stocks. It is a risk, I think, going forward, but not a risk where I'd be looking to sell my stock. Absolutely not. So moving on to Amazon, start of the week 31.32, end of the week down about $30 a share. Again, not a lot of news out of Amazon except they were the hosting provider of Parler and they decided to pull that. So man, just a lot of power centralized around these companies, and when they decide to unleash that banhammer, boy, it does have a lot of impact on a lot of circles out there. So right now they're aimed at President Trump, former President Trump, some of his supporters, some of his fans. I tell you what, at some point, it'll probably shift. It'll go in another direction. And if it does that, guess what? Everybody's not going to like these companies, and we'll see what happens to their share prices at that point. Now, Netflix started the week at about 500, end of the week about 500. We'll talk about this more when we look at the stock chart with Netflix. What I do like about Netflix is, boy, they've just kind of skirted by a lot of this political talk, which I think at the current moment is probably a good idea, although I think this stuff will eventually blow over at some point. Netflix data shows that international subscribers is booming despite the domestic slowdown. This is actually something we've talked about here, not only on the recap show, but when I do individual videos on Netflix. It sure looks like domestically here in the United States that their growth is their best days are over in terms of growth here in the United States. How they're going to grow here in the United States is by raising prices, okay? They basically have turned themselves into the Costco model where they have kind of a little bit of churn going, they have a little bit of growth, but the way they're going to squeeze more out of their customers, squeeze more profits out of the domestic business is just raise prices. Now, international subscriber is still booming, so they don't necessarily, we saw, I think they're raising prices in the UK, but eventually that's going to slow and they're going to raise prices there. And that's when Netflix's business can really be analyzed, I think, in a totality, when subscribers kind of level out and then they start raising prices to see what kind of churn they get. I think that'll be interesting. I think Netflix got a long ways to go before we get there, probably at least 24 months before we kind of see something like that happening. Google, again, wrapped up in a lot of this political talk, booted President Trump off of the platform, at least YouTube. So he gave a news conference and they kicked him off the YouTube. So we'll see if I would suppose these things will be permanent. I don't necessarily see Donald Trump kind of begging to get back onto these platforms, although I could be wrong about that. Google says its acquisition of Fitbit is complete, but hold the horses. U.S. Justice Department says its review on the deal is still ongoing. So we'll see what happens there, but I would imagine that will get finalized at some point since Google seems to be friendly with the incoming administration. Google started the week 1768, basically ended up a little lower than that. When we get over the stock chart, interesting levels that it is approaching. Microsoft, again, actually doing a nice job kind of avoiding a lot of the political speak. Started the week at 217, slid down to 212. Again, kind of just in a holding pattern for earnings. Now, pandemic is bringing new consoles push and video game sales grew to a record 7.7 billion. That's with a B in December. Video games are just absolutely on fire. Not breaking any news there. Obviously, Microsoft is well positioned to capture a fair amount of that business. Same with Amazon with Twitch. Moving on to Tesla, started the week 839, slid down a little bit, peaked up, slid down. This stock is consolidating. I think that's actually good news. We'll get over the stock chart with Tesla. Consolidating sideways when you've made a big move is not that bad when it comes to Tesla. Now, here's the big news for Tesla. They're forecasted by, let's see, I can't remember, Wedbush, I think is the analyst group that came out and said 1 million cars in 2022. We'll see what happens to Tesla's valuation if they can get to 1 million cars by 2022. That's a pretty aggressive forecast, but given the lead that Tesla has on all the other EVs that are out there, it probably is probable. So moving on to the stock charts, Facebook I shouldn't have to tell you. If you've been following this show with any regularity, we are at an absolute key level here. We're on a defined downtrend, but we've hit our target price down here at 247. Actually, the stock's at 250, but intraday, it's wicked through this key level that we have here. You could probably move this around a little bit, drop it down just slightly right here at 246-ish. We're right here, anywhere in this box over the last, this is over 4 months, because this is back in August here. Anytime Facebook has dipped into this channel from 247 to call it 250, the stock has reversed and rallied. Will that happen again? I don't know. We do have earnings approaching for Facebook, and I can imagine they're probably going to be pretty darn good. So it could reverse at that point. We'll see what happens with what they do with guidance. A lot of it has to do with guidance. There's probably going to be a lot of commentary on the call too about the banning of a president and whether or not that's a good idea or not. And depending on how well Facebook communicates that type of things, not only with investors, but with their user base as well, certainly could send shares up or down, but we are at a key level with Facebook. Moving on to Apple, just consolidating kind of in the upper end of this range. Any pullback to 125-ish would be an intermediate buying opportunity, in my opinion. Any pullback here. Now, we're kind of flagging out here. We'll see what happens. Again, Apple's in a holding pattern, likely until earnings. I would guess this stock will trade sideways a little bit and move one way or another when we get to earnings. Wouldn't necessarily want to get into this one unless you had a really strong conviction one way or another. Moving on to Amazon, talking about consolidating. This one is consolidating. It is at an interesting level, 3103, 3100. It's actually up here. 3100 is not a bad level. Okay, we've marked this out. This is what I would call an intermediate level. I would rather step in here lower. I'd rather step in here at 2900 or something like that. Obviously, Amazon is going to come out with earnings, and in my opinion, they're probably going to be an absolute blowout winner. How much of that is priced into Amazon stock already? I don't know. It's been consolidated sideways. We've seen Apple made a nice run. Obviously, Tesla and some of these other stocks, even Google, have made a nice run up. So it could be that if Amazon has a great quarter and then gives great guidance, this could shoot it up. Any shoot above 3,300 on strong volume, I think we could retest these highs, which are about up here at 3,550. So interesting level for Amazon. Certainly could be in here trading these stocks, but you just want to keep in mind earnings are coming, and if they disappoint, or guidance disappoints, or commentary on the conference call disappoints for whatever reason, these stocks could easily go either way. Moving on to Netflix. Okay, so this one's just been extremely predictable. Anytime Netflix over $510, it has kind of shot up and then come back down. We're in kind of an intermediate zone here. I would wait to see if this one gets down to 470. I think Netflix reports next week, or it reports very soon. We'll see what happens when they do report. I think it's a pretty well telegraphed report, but if it does shoot down to 470, I think that does create a buying opportunity, in my opinion, for Netflix. Moving on to Google, this one's just consolidating sideways. It is on just in cruise control. It is actually at a level, if you believe it's going to bounce here and go higher when Google reports their earnings, which I can anticipate being fairly strong as well, since last quarter was actually kind of an upside surprise. That's what kind of propelled the stock going upwards here. So we'll see what happens with Google. I can imagine next quarter will be pretty good. How much of that is priced in? We'll see what happens. But again, this one's at a level. If you want to buy Google, I wouldn't blame you for buying at this level as well. Moving on to Microsoft, again, very much a little bit like Google, although we're not above the highs here, but we're kind of channeling sideways here with Microsoft. This one looks pretty good to me if it wants to bounce here. Right around 210 would be a spot where if you want to get in this one, not a bad spot. It's not the best spot, but you could potentially jump in here at Microsoft, hoping that they have a good earnings report, and then we shoot up, maybe back up to the 220s, and then maybe even if it's a really good good report, back up to all-time highs of $230 per share. Now, finally, Tesla is consolidating sideways. I'll zoom in here so we can see this consolidation a little bit better. You see here, we're kind of going sideways. Okay, with Tesla, that's not a bad thing when you've made this monster move. I mean, in like 2 months, we've gone from about $400 per share. I know because I bought a share or two down here at 400 and now we're at 800. It's basically doubled like in 2 months. Okay, going sideways with Tesla would, in my opinion, be a positive thing. Okay, so it's consolidating sideways. You could want to accumulate here if you want to. This upward trend is still intact. It could lead to higher prices, higher momentum in this stock. Any break of this momentum anywhere below, I'd call it about 775 in the next 3 or 4 trading days, would break momentum, would break trend. You'd probably come back. There's actually some intermediate consolidation that I see right in here. It's really tight though, because when you're on a straight line up, there's a little bit of consolidation here between 550 and call it 650. Any pullback into that area would be where I would first want to, legitimately want to step in on this one. If you're trading this one, if you're holding it, just hold on for the ride. If you're trading it, have fun with it. You're probably making money, at least if you're on the long side of this one. So that's our recap show for the week. Hopefully you guys had a great weekend. Consider hitting that thumbs up button. And if you haven't subscribed already, check out some of my other videos and consider doing that as well. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back again next week. Good luck with your investments.